Hello, welcome back to Let's Talk Title with Emerald Coast Title Services. I am President and host, Dion Moniz.
And I'm Ashley Bowen, a licensed title agent and the Director of Operations for Emerald Coast Title Services.
So today, hot off the press, we have the new revised buyer-broker agreements.
Yes.
And so we're going to pretend like you've never seen a buyer-broker agreement, or BBA as we're going to call it. And we're going to go down the BBA and touch on the changes from the last form. But for those of you who are not familiar with the BBA, this will be an overall explanation. And we'll be doing a class with ECAR next month, August the 5th, for those of you who want to come and get a full class on it.
You guys should be able to sign up for that on the ECAR education calendar. And now this buyer-broker agreement is going to be required, either this or a showing agreement by the state on August 17th, but by the Emerald Coast Association of Realtors August 12th. So you guys need to know what they are and be ready for them.
Yes, and of course get with your broker on what their decision is. Some brokers are implementing this now to go ahead and get into the practice. But yes, like Ashley said, for the ECAR area, they are mandatory as of August 12th. And you need to either have this BBA that we're going to go over or a showing agreement in place for each buyer that you represent. All right.
Before access to property.
Before showing a property.
Let's get started.
All right, let's dive on in. So, number one of the form, obviously, that's the parties. Instead of using the term buyer, it's now consumer.
We think that's kind of funny. But it matches with the CFPB laws that went into effect in 2015, where they called the buyer the consumer throughout all of that documentation, and the closing was the consummation. Our Florida forms never matched those federal forms, but this BBA they did for some reason.
Yeah.
So it's a consumer here.
It's a consumer. Although I'm probably still going to say buyer throughout this episode, but so just know that this form says consumer.
Yeah, buyer and consumer are one and the same here.
Yes. So moving on, Section 2 is where you're going to put the term of the BBA, and you can have it as short as a day or as long as a year, or really as long as you want to make it.
But it does terminate at 11:59 p.m. on a day, so it's not for an hour. It's going to have to be a minimum of a day.
Yes, yes. One of the class we were in, they were making a joke about it's good for as long as you are eating your sandwich. But obviously, yes, a day is as short as you want it to be, and it's just going to depend on what you negotiate with your buyer. What we have learned in doing these classes with for other brokerages is Florida is in the minority. Florida, a lot of other states are already using these and have been using them for years, and so it's a norm. Obviously, they're new to Florida, and for the next maybe year, it's going to be a little awkward explaining these to buyers, but in about a year or two, the buyers are going to expect these BBAs, and it won't be...
And currently, buyers from other states may expect it.
Right, exactly. So just know that whatever term you set for the BBA, that is basically the time frame that you're protected. So any properties that you show to the buyer, or any properties that the buyer may purchase during the term of the BBA, is going to trigger the commission that's set forth that we'll get into a little bit later.
Compensation.
Compensation, yes. It's now called compensation. Yeah. I might say commission, but it's compensation in the agreement. So yeah, thank you for that clarification. So number 3 is property. They have changed this a little bit. Section A is type of property, and you can be very broad and say residential or commercial. Well, this is really for residential. But you can be as broad as just say residential property, or you can be as narrow as indicating certain addresses.
A condominium in a certain, a unit in a condominium, or you could say, like you said, residential and be very, very broad.
Yeah, and the same thing with Section B, which is location. Again, you can be very broad and say destined to Fort Walton or Emerald Coast.
Or Okaloosa County or Walton County. Or you could do a neighborhood. You own a property within a certain subdivision.
Yes.
Or you can be as specific as the property address.
Right. And so the purpose of that, and again, it depends on what you negotiate with your buyer, but the geographical location that you put into this BBA is going to be your protection area. So again, if a buyer buys any property within the area specified in your BBA, even if you did not show them the property, it still triggers the compensation under the BBA. So again, that's something to negotiate with your buyer as to how short or long you want the term and how broad or narrow you want the location or geographical area to be covered. All right. Section 4 goes over the, well, stepping back. So they did make a change. The old BBA used to have additional sections for a price range and preferred terms, and they did away with that. So you now don't have to specify what price range the property needs to be in.
That's good.
Yeah. So better protection for the broker and you as buyer's agent. Next up is Section 4, which is broker's obligations. This just sets forth the various obligations that the broker has, basically fiduciary duties to the buyer. One thing they did add, which I thought was really important, was they added a sentence under subsection B that says, consumer understands that even if broker is compensated by an owner or a real estate licensee who is working with an owner, such compensation does not compromise broker's duties to consumer. And so
what does that mean?
So that kind of covers the ethical dilemma that a buyer's agent might have, where not only are they representing the buyer to acquire a property, but now they're also having to negotiate a commission coming from seller's side, so that buyer won't be on the hook for the whole commission. So there was kind of a dichotomy of, well, how do we represent the buyer but then still try to negotiate a commission that may be adverse to buyer's interests? Is it going to impact whether the broker shows certain properties that don't pay seller side commission, buyer side commission by seller? So this just specifies that even though the broker or the buyer's agent is negotiating that commission to come off seller side, it does not impact broker's fiduciary duties to the buyer.
Okay.
So it's good clarification for that.
Spells it out.
Yeah, exactly. The next section is Section 5, which goes over the consumer's obligations, and it basically, puts various duties on the consumer to cooperate with the broker, to provide the financials, to figure out what they could qualify for, to help, in providing or making the offers on contracts.
Being available,
yes. And importantly, they added a Section G to this form that now says or requires the consumer to make a diligent, good faith effort to perform the contract terms of any purchase agreement and to close. And the reason that is important is because now, under the compensation section, once a property goes under contract, if the buyer defaults under that contract, the compensation is still owed. So now it puts a duty of good faith and diligent effort on the buyer, so that the buyer's broker or agent is protected. So again, once it goes under contract, that commission is deemed earned. And so if buyer doesn't cooperate or act diligently and close, and it's deemed a buyer default under the contract, then that commission is still going to be triggered.
I really like that. I'm going to read it out loud again.
Do it.
Making a diligent, good faith effort to perform the contract terms of any purchase agreement or contract to lease and close the sale of any property consumer contracts to acquire. So they're putting it a duty to close on that property.
Yeah.
It should already be like that.
Yeah.
I'm glad they spelled it out.
Right. It was already implied, but now it's in black and white.
That's good.
So,
That's
yes,
good.
Very good. So the next two sections talk about how you get paid under these BBAs. And there's two ways. One is the retainer, which is Section 6, and it's non-refundable, and it's a stated fee. And it specifies that the retainer is going to be in addition to any compensation that's agreed to under Section 7. So that's important, because the prior form, you had boxes to check to say it's in addition to or can offset the commission under Section 7. But now it clearly states it's in addition to.
Okay.
So also important later on, in that the retainer is not considered part of the compensation being paid under Section 7, which we'll explain the importance of that later.
Now, I had never read a BBA until the NAR lawsuit came out. I like the idea of the retainer because a buyer agent puts a lot of money into showing 100 properties to buyers before they ever even go under contract, and so that retainer puts some money in their pocket ahead of time. I like it.
Yeah, and so this is just coming out, so we have yet to see whether the retainers are used that much, but it's good to have the option.
Mm-hmm.
So you can also be paid as on a commission basis, which is now compensation under Section 7. And that can be, again, in addition to the retainer or in lieu of. So if you don't want a retainer and you just want to go under a standard commission basis, then that's where Section 7 comes in. And you're going to indicate the percentage or the amount for a purchase, a lease, a purchase option under a lease, and I think that's it actually. Those are all the different types of commissions you can earn.
It says other. Broker will be compensated for all other types of acquisitions.
True, yeah. So there's a catch-all in there. Yeah. So basically anything the buyer does during the term of this BBA is going to trigger this commission.
If he acquires something, yes.
And it also has a section at E for additional fees. I don't know what that would be, but if you wanted to add some more fees in there, you could.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Maybe plus a bonus or something, I guess you could add there.
Yeah, I guess.
An additional.
So again, the commission is deemed earned as soon as a property goes under contract, and it's payable either upon closing or if the buyer defaults under the contract. So the old form did not specify the default. Well, it did specify the default language later, but they folded it up under Section 7. And it does clarify that whatever commission might be earned or paid by the seller side will reduce the amount that's owed by the buyer under the BBA. So if you have in the BBA that you're going to get paid 3% by the buyer, and your agent you're able to negotiate, or the seller is willing to pay 2% to the buyer, then your buyer only owes the delta, or 1%, under the BBA.
Okay.
Now you can add language later that says, hey, we're willing to discount this. If the seller side pays less than 3%, we'll discount our fee up to X amount. That can be included under Section 13, additional terms, or you can just execute a modification if something comes along and the property or the seller's not paying as much and you want to renegotiate the fee or the commission under this Section 7.
Because I do want to point out under Section, I want to point it out here, even though it's listed in Section 14, that in bold underlined print it says, broker may not receive compensation from any source that exceeds the amount of the rate agreed to with the consumer. So if you had if it was the opposite and you had the buyer, the agreement with the buyer was 2% and the seller was offering 3%, you could only get 2%. And at that point, you would probably want to modify this agreement and change it to 3% so that you can get the full amount that the seller is willing to offer.
Absolutely. Yeah, and in that situation, the buyer won't care because the buyer's
he's not paying it
anyway.
Right. You get more money, everybody's happy.
Right. But just know that you have to do a modification if you're going to get paid more from seller side than you've agreed to accept or get paid by your buyer under the BBA. Mm-hmm. But flipping it back, if you don't get paid as much from seller side, then the buyer is on the hook for the delta to pay that at closing, unless you agree to waive it, which again would be a modification, or have special terms under Section 13 to address that. And we can provide that language if needed. We've been sending them out to brokers to kind of cut and paste into their BBAs if they want it. So if you'd like that information, just reach out to us and we'll send it to you.
Ashley at ects.com.
Yes. ASHLEY.
Yeah.
All right. So moving on, Section 8 is the protection period. So this is very similar to what's in your listing agreements, to where if the agreement is terminated, but the buyer proceeds with closing on a property that you showed them during the term of the BBA, then the commission is still owed. Now there's a default 30-day protection period in there that wasn't in there before, so that's been added. But just know that you've got this tail protection, as I like to call it, for if you show property and the BBA terminates, but you're within that protection period when they go under contract, then your commission is still going to be triggered.
I like the protection period.
Yeah, it's good. And they've always had it in the listing agreement to protect the seller side, but now it's in the BBA to protect the buyer side as well. Section 9 is conditional termination. Conditional termination. It used to be called early termination, And they basically rewrote this whole section, but essentially what it is there to do is if the buyer, let's say the buyer's moving and they want to terminate this agreement early, they can do that, but what it does is it has a clawback. So if buyer ends up misrepresenting and they really are not moving and they end up buying the property that you showed them, through another agent after this conditional termination, but if it's still within what would have been the original term of the BBA
plus protection period,
then your commission is triggered. So it provides, like I said, it allows the buyer to get out if needed, but if they're not being truthful about it,
it protects you.
Yeah, they try to get sneaky, you're going to be protected and still get your commission.
Nice.
Or your commission will be owed.
Nice.
It gives you a cause of action at least.
And now Dion's favorite.
My favorite, yes. So Section 10 under dispute resolution, they've changed this significantly. Before, you could only do mediation and then arbitration. There was no attorney fee clause in there. In Florida, under contract law, if you're going to have a contract dispute, if in order for the prevailing party to get their attorney's fees back from the non-prevailing party, you have to have an attorney fee clause in the contract. The old BBA didn't have that. I complain about it every time I get in class, so
Sure did.
Florida realtors must have heard me. They've made the addition or the change, so now it specifies, number one, that BBA is going to be construed under Florida law, which should have been a given, but at least now it's in black and white. It still allows for mediation in the beginning, and then you have an option of either arbitration or litigation. And if you have to both initial the blanks for arbitration in order for arbitration to kick in, otherwise it defaults to litigation, and the prevailing party in that litigation gets their attorney's fees back. So very important, because if you're able to go, hey, you owe me this commission, if you make me sue you, you're going to owe the commission plus my attorney's fees. That has a little more teeth and should, hopefully avoid litigation and get that buyer just to pay the commission that's owed. So good stuff. That's my favorite change in the entire form.
Yeah. Of course, it would be an attorney's favorite change.
It makes me happy. And then Section 12, this is going to change depending on what role you're playing. If you're a single agent or a transaction broker.
Or a single agent who transitions to a transaction broker.
Right.
Or a no brokerage.
There's
4 forms here.
Yes.
And paragraph 12 is the only thing that changes depending on which form or which type of agent that you're going to be.
Right. So make sure you choose the correct form. I think the standard is transaction broker. So that's probably the one that's going to be used the most. But just make sure that you're using the correct one and that Section 12 references the proper relationship that you have with your buyer. Okay, Section 13 is other terms. Again, that's kind of wide open to add the additional stuff. One of those being the discount that you might agree to if seller side is paying less than what's stated in the BBA.
But it's really important for you guys not to be drafting your own language to put in these legal forms.
Correct.
Because that would be practicing law without a license. And so if you need additional terms, then you can just reach out to us and an attorney to get a language from an attorney to put in those spaces.
Yep. Ashley at ects.com.
Yeah. ASHLEY.
All right, and last but not least, Section 14, which Ashley, you've already touched on, but I do like that they added electronic signatures are acceptable and binding, which is already kind of written into the Florida statutes now, but I always like to see that in the contract. That way DocuSign and Simplifile or...
makes our lives easier. Yeah. And then another of the big bolded and underlined language that they had in here, I didn't read all of it before, it says broker commissions are not set by law and are fully negotiable. And that is the disclaimer that is required from all of the NAR lawsuits.
Yes, exactly. So that's in there now in big, bold, underlined language. And touching on the sentence that Ashley read earlier, where the broker cannot receive compensation in excess of the compensation in the BBA, again, this does not include the retainer. So again, this is where if you're getting a retainer and a commission, you don't count the retainer towards the commission for purposes of this sentence. So it's excluded from the commission part of it.
But there is language in here that allows additional commission in excess of the BBA language when the broker has both sides.
Exactly. Yeah, it specifically carves out and says that a broker may receive separate compensation from the owner of the property for services rendered to the owner by broker for which consumer is not responsible.
So that's
if they're working both sides.
Seller paying broker for what the broker did for the seller.
Exactly. So great protection added for the broker there. That way if the broker is working both sides, then broker gets whatever they are getting from seller, they get whatever they're getting from buyer and BBA, and the two don't conflict with each other.
Okay, so good stuff.
Good to go.
So you approved the forms. You liked these. A lot of times when we get
changes.
When we get new changes, you have your own changes you want to make.
You're right.
Good.
Yeah. So I'm very happy with the changes. This BBA form is much better now. So again, just keep in mind that as of August 12th, this goes into effect. And we're going to cover in another episode the compensation agreements that you have to have in place in conjunction with these BBAs. And the compensation agreements address the commission that's coming from seller side to the buyer's broker. So now you're going to have a contract, a BBA, and a commission agreement. That's all kind of be used together.
And you guys probably are going to need help keeping all that together. So be sure to reach out to us. Ashley at ects.com.
Yes. Or 850-650-0010.
650-0077. That's
Sorry,
the law
yes,
firm number.
I gave the law firm number.
Or our contact information is below. And we would be happy to bring a BBA class to your brokerage. If you want to have Dion come to your office and have his time for an hour, and then he can go over this with you guys individually, and then you have time to ask questions personally. We can set that up too. Again, reach out to us.
Yeah, typically our classes, they end up lasting like an hour because there's a lot of questions about these. And so this is just a quick and dirty explanation. We're sure you're going to have questions about it, at least until it becomes the norm. So like Ashley said, we're happy to come to you and teach it to you and your other agents. So just let us know. All right, well, that's going to do it for this episode. We'll see you next time. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.